The neighborhood of Pinecrest Estates had always prided itself on being a peaceful enclave, with manicured lawns and friendly neighbors who exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences. That was until the day Michael Donovan returned home from a business trip to find his newly renovated swimming pool filled with rapidly hardening cement. It wasn't an accident or an act of nature. It was the handiwork of his next-door neighbor, Elaine Winters, a woman the entire neighborhood had taken to calling Karen. Michael stood at the edge of his once pristine azure pool, now a grotesque concrete basin, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across his once perfect backyard oasis. His mouth hung open in disbelief as he tried to process the destruction before him. The $85,000 pool renovation he had completed just 2 weeks ago, gone. The water features, the custom lighting, the heated jets, all entombed in gray industrial cement that had already begun to set. "I don't understand," he whispered to his wife, Sarah, who stood beside him with tears streaming down her face. "Who would do this?" The answer came in the form of security footage from the cameras they'd installed after a series of escalating disputes with Elaine. The footage showed their 58-year-old neighbor directing a cement truck to back into their driveway while they were away. She had supervised his workers, likely told this was a legitimate job, pumped load after load of cement into the pool. The timestamp showed she had done this 3 days ago, giving the cement ample time to harden completely. "She's finally lost her mind," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and rage. "This isn't just petty neighbor stuff anymore, Michael. This is criminal." The feud between Michael and Elaine had begun innocuously enough 18 months ago. Michael's family had moved to Pinecrest Estates seeking the suburban dream, a safe community to raise their 2 children, Emma and Jake, with good schools and neighbors who looked out for each other. For the first 6 months, everything had been perfect. Then came the pool project. Elaine had opposed it from the start, filing complaints with the Homeowners Association, claiming the construction would disrupt the neighborhood's tranquility. When the HOA approved Michael's plans, she began documenting every minor code violation she could find, workers arriving 5 minutes before the permitted construction hours, trucks parked slightly over the property line, noise levels that barely exceeded regulations. Her complaints escalated to daily calls to local authorities. Police officers and city inspectors became regular visitors to Michael's address, though they rarely found any violations worth citing. The construction dragged on weeks longer than planned due to the constant interruptions, costing Michael thousands in additional labor costs. When the pool was finally completed, Michael had hoped the worst was behind them. He even invited Elaine to the pool's unveiling party as a peace offering, hoping to mend fences. She had declined with a terse note stating she would never support such wasteful extravagance. Now, as Michael surveyed the destruction, he pulled out his phone and called the police. This wasn't a noise complaint or a permit dispute. This was destruction of property on a massive scale. "Yes, I'd like to report vandalism," he said when the dispatcher answered. His voice was surprisingly calm, a stark contrast to the chaos churning inside him. "My neighbor has filled my swimming pool with cement. I have it all on video." As he waited for the police to arrive, Michael watched Elaine through the gaps in the fence. She was calmly watering her prized roses, a self-satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She had no idea that her actions had crossed a line from which there would be no return, a line that would soon lead her directly into a criminal courtroom. The arrival of 3 police cruisers in the quiet cul-de-sac drew neighbors from their homes like moths to a flame. They gathered in small clusters, whispering behind cupped hands as officers strode purposefully toward the Donovan residence. Detective Warren Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the force, had seen his share of neighbor disputes, but nothing quite like this. "So you're telling me she just filled it with cement?" Detective Hayes asked, his weathered face unable to mask his disbelief as he stared at the ruined pool. "The whole thing." Michael nodded grimly, pulling up the security footage on his tablet. 3 days ago, while we were visiting my parents in Chicago, she must have been planning this for weeks. The video evidence was damning. There was Elaine, unmistakable in her trademark sun hat and gardening gloves, directing the cement truck with emphatic gestures. She appeared to be showing workers what appeared to be official-looking papers, likely fraudulent permits, and pointing authoritatively at the pool. "Did you authorize anyone to do work on your property while you were away?" Detective Hayes asked, though he already knew the answer. "Absolutely not," Sarah replied, her earlier tears now replaced by cold fury. "We didn't even tell her we were going out of town. She must have been watching the house." While 2 officers remained with Michael and Sarah, Detective Hayes and another officer made their way next door. The detective's knock was answered by Elaine, who appeared startlingly composed despite the police presence. "Mrs. Winters," Detective Hayes began, "we're investigating an incident of property damage at your neighbor's residence. Would you mind answering a few questions?" Elaine's placid expression didn't waver. "I have nothing to hide, Detective. Those people have been violating neighborhood regulations for over a year now. That pool is an eyesore and a noise nuisance." "Ma'am, are you aware that their pool has been filled with cement?" "Is that what happened?" She replied with unconvincing surprise. "How unfortunate." Detective Hayes studied her face carefully. "We have video footage showing you directing a cement truck onto their property 3 days ago." For the first time, Elaine's composure cracked slightly. A fleeting look of panic crossed her features before she recovered. "That must be some mistake. I was at my sister's house in Springfield all weekend." The detective made a note in his pad. "We'll need to verify that alibi, Mrs. Winters. Can you provide your sister's contact information?" As the questioning continued, officers were obtaining search warrants for Elaine's property and financial records. By nightfall, they had discovered receipts for a cash payment to Midwest Concrete Supply dated 3 days prior and a series of emails to a contractor who had been told the job was an emergency pool decommissioning authorized by the homeowners. The contractor, when contacted, was horrified to learn he had been duped. She had papers with signatures. He explained frantically to the police, said the owners were out of town but needed the pool filled immediately because of a major leak threatening the foundation. The following morning, Elaine Winters was arrested at her home. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as she was led to a police car in handcuffs, still wearing her bathrobe and slippers. Her face, usually pinched with disapproval, now bore the shocked expression of someone who never expected consequences for their actions. At the police station, the charges were read aloud: criminal mischief, criminal trespass, forgery of documents, and destruction of property. Given the value of the damaged pool, the destruction charge alone was classified as a felony. "I was protecting property values," Elaine insisted during her booking. "That monstrosity violated the neighborhood aesthetic. I sent 37 complaints to the HOA, and they did nothing." As word spread through Pinecrest Estates about Elaine's arrest, other neighbors came forward with stories of their own encounters with her. The Paddles had been reported for cooking odorous foods outdoors. The Levinsons had received threatening letters about their children's basketball hoop. The Garcia family had been the subject of multiple noise complaints for hosting family gatherings on Sunday afternoons. Michael and Sarah, meanwhile, faced the daunting task of removing tons of hardened cement from their property. Insurance adjusters delivered the grim news. The damage would cost well over $100,000 to repair, and their policy had exclusions for intentional vandalism by neighbors. "We'll sue her for the damages," Michael said that evening as they sat in their living room, the backyard floodlights illuminating the concrete disaster through the windows. "Her house is worth at least $600,000. She'll have to sell it to pay us back." Sarah touched his arm gently. "And then what?" "We'll still be known as the couple whose neighbor went to jail. The kids are already hearing about it at school." Michael had no answer. The pool had been meant to bring their family joy. Instead, it had become the centerpiece of what was quickly becoming the neighborhood's most notorious feud, one that was far from over. The preliminary hearing for the state v. Elaine Winters was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early June, 6 weeks after the cement incident. The courtroom was packed. Nearly half of Pinecrest Estates had shown up, dividing themselves like wedding guests, choosing sides of the aisle. Most sat behind Michael and Sarah, a show of solidarity against what they now viewed as a neighborhood menace. But surprisingly, a small contingent of older residents clustered behind Elaine, their expressions grim but supportive. Elaine had hired Lawrence Pemberton, an expensive defense attorney known for handling high-profile cases in the county. His presence suggested that Elaine was taking the charges seriously, despite her continued insistence to anyone who would listen that she was merely enforcing neighborhood standards. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Melissa Chen, opened with a straightforward presentation of the facts. "Your Honor, this is not a case of a minor disagreement between neighbors," she stated firmly. "The defendant executed a premeditated plan to destroy property valued at nearly $100,000. She forged documents, impersonated the homeowners, and deliberately missold contractors to commit this act while the victims were away from their home." Ada Chen displayed the security footage on the courtroom monitor. The images were crystal clear. Elaine directing the cement truck, supervising the pouring, even smiling as she watched the pool fill with gray sludge. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. When Pemberton rose for the defense, his strategy became immediately apparent. "Your Honor, while we do not dispute that my client was involved in this unfortunate incident, we intend to demonstrate that Mrs. Winters was suffering from a significant mental health crisis following the death of her husband last year." Michael and Sarah exchanged surprised glances. Elaine's husband had indeed passed away 14 months earlier after a long battle with cancer, but neither had connected this to her increasingly erratic behavior. Furthermore, Pemberton continued, "We will present evidence that Mr. Donovan's pool construction violated several county ordinances regarding proximity to property lines and water runoff management. Mrs. Winters had documented water damage to her foundation resulting from improper drainage." The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Judge Eleanor Hargrove, seemed unimpressed. Mr. Pemberton, even if these allegations are true, they would not justify your client's actions. There are legal remedies for such disputes. We understand, Your Honor. We are not justifying the actions but explaining the context of diminished capacity. As the hearing continued, Michael realized with growing unease that this case was becoming more complex than he had anticipated. What had seemed like a clear-cut case of criminal vandalism was evolving into a murky examination of mental health, property rights, and the breakdown of neighborhood civility. Outside the courtroom during a recess, Michael was approached by Harold Gibbons, a 72-year-old president of the Homeowners Association. "Michael, this has gone too far," Harold said quietly. "Look, Elaine was wrong, no question. But do you really want to see her in prison? She's been part of this community for 30 years. She destroyed our pool, Harold," Michael replied incredulously. "She forged my signature. She's been harassing us since we moved in. What will you have me do?" Harold sighed heavily. "The HOA board met last night. We've received complaints about this situation from both sides. Some people think you're pushing too hard for maximum charges. Some people," Michael's voice rose, "who exactly is defending what she did?" Harold gestured toward the small group of older residents who had sat behind Elaine. "Pinecrest has changed a lot in recent years. Folks like Elaine feel like they're losing the neighborhood they built. Not that it excuses anything," he added hastily, seeing Michael's expression darken. "But there's talk of mediation, maybe a settlement." "A settlement?" Sarah had joined them, her expression incredulous. "Our children are afraid to play in their own backyard because they can see that concrete monstrosity from their bedroom windows. Emma has nightmares about the mean lady coming to our house again." Back in the courtroom, Judge Hargrove announced her decision. "There is sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all charges. Bail is set at $50,000. As Elaine was led away by a bailiff, she looked smaller somehow, the fight temporarily drained from her. Michael caught her eye for a brief moment and was surprised to see not anger or defiance, but something that looked almost like fear. Later that evening, the Donovans received an unexpected visitor. Amy Winters, Elaine's daughter, stood awkwardly on their front porch, a manila envelope clutched in her hands. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just flew in from Seattle. I wanted to apologize for what my mother did." Sarah hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Would you like to come in?" Over coffee at the kitchen table, Amy painted a picture of mother Michael and Sarah barely recognized. Elaine had been a dedicated elementary school teacher for 30 years, beloved by generations of students. Her husband's prolonged illness had drained their savings and left Elaine deeply depressed. The pool construction had coincided with the 1-year anniversary of his death. She became fixated on it, Amy explained, wiping away tears. "Called me every day about the noise, the trucks, how the workers were destroying her garden. I should have realized something was wrong, but I have my own family, my job. I just didn't see how bad it had gotten." She slid the envelope across the table. "These are the titles to her car and her house. They're paid off. She's authorized me to sell everything to pay for your damages. She doesn't want to fight anymore." Michael stared at the documents, the anger that had sustained him for weeks suddenly complicated by this new information. What about her defense? Her lawyer was talking about diminished capacity, property line violations. Amy shook her head. "That's just legal maneuvering. She knows what she did was wrong. She's not the mother I knew. She needs help, not prison." As Amy left, Michael and Sarah stood in their living room, the weight of a decision neither had anticipated pressing down on them. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked quietly. Michael gazed out at their backyard, where contractors had begun the laborious process of breaking up the cement with jackhammers. The noise was constant, jarring, a daily reminder of their neighbor's unhinged vengeance. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we need to talk to the DA." The district attorney's office was housed in a modern glass building downtown, a stark contrast to the historic courthouse where the preliminary hearing had taken place. Assistant DA Melissa Chen met with Michael and Sarah in a conference room with views of the city skyline. She listened intently as they recounted their conversation with Elaine's daughter. "I understand your conflicted feelings," Chen said after they finished, "but I need to be clear. This isn't just about you and Mrs. Winters anymore. This case has implications for how we handle property crimes and neighborhood disputes throughout the county." She pulled out a thick folder and laid several photographs on the table. "Since news of this case broke, we've received reports of similar incidents. A man in Riverside who destroyed his neighbor's garden with herbicide. A woman in Hampton Hills who cut down protected trees on adjacent property. People are watching to see if there are real consequences for these actions." Michael ran a hand through his hair. "So you're saying even if we wanted to drop the charges, you wouldn't? The state can proceed without victim cooperation?" "Yes, but that's not what I'm suggesting." Chen leaned forward. "There's a middle path here. We could offer a plea deal. felony criminal mischief with a suspended sentence contingent on full restitution, community service, and mandatory psychiatric treatment. Sarah glanced at Michael. She wouldn't go to prison, not if she complies with all conditions, but she would have a felony record, and if she violated probation or harassed anyone else, she'd face immediate incarceration. As they left the DA's office, Michael and Sarah walked in silence for several blocks, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke. I keep thinking about what Amy said about Elaine being a teacher all those years. How many lives did she touch positively before whatever this is took over? Michael nodded slowly. I've been thinking about my dad. Remember how he changed after Mom died? The anger, the paranoia, was like living with a stranger for a while. But he got help, Sarah reminded him. He didn't pour cement in anyone's pool. No, but we were there for him. Elaine was alone. 2 days later, they met with Pemberton, Elaine's attorney, at his office. Amy Winters joined them, looking exhausted but determined. Pemberton began with the formality of a man who had spent decades negotiating settlements. My client is prepared to accept full financial responsibility for the damages, he stated. The house and vehicle can be liquidated within 60 days. Furthermore, she's agreed to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment. Michael nodded. We've spoken with the DA. They're willing to offer a plea deal that would keep her out of prison if she meets certain conditions. Amy's relief was palpable. Thank you, she whispered. I know it doesn't undo what happened, but there's one more thing, Sarah interrupted gently. We want to meet with her, face to face. Pemberton's brow furrowed. I'm not sure that's advisable at this stage. Anything she says called. Not as part of the legal proceedings, Michael clarified. Just as neighbors. We've lived next to each other for almost 2 years, and we've never really talked. Not once. The meeting took place the following week at Pemberton's office. Elaine entered the conference room with shuffling steps, her usual immaculate appearance now diminished. Her hair, normally perfectly coiffed, hung limp around her face. The confident posture that had so infuriated Michael during their previous encounters was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone expecting another blow. An uncomfortable silence filled the room after introductions were made. Finally, Elaine spoke, her voice barely audible. I don't know what to say. Sorry seems inadequate. Michael had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but sitting across from this deflated version of his nemesis, the prepared speech felt wrong. Instead, he asked simply, why? Why not just talk to us if the pool was causing problems? Elaine's eyes welled with tears. I tried in the beginning. I left notes, I called the HOA. But then, she trailed off, looking down at her hands. After Roger died, everything felt like an assault. The noise, the workers playing music, the machinery. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. It was like the whole world was moving on, built-in things, making noise while my life had stopped completely. Sarah, who had been watching silently, spoke up. We had no idea about your husband, or the water damage to your foundation. Why didn't you just tell us? Would you have listened? Elaine asked, a flash of her old defiance briefly visible. You were so excited about your pool, your parties, your perfect family life. I became invisible, an annoyance. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, painful truths emerging from both sides. Michael admitted they had dismissed Elaine's early complaints too easily. Elaine acknowledged that her grief had twisted into resentment and paranoia. As they prepared to leave, Michael made an unexpected offer. When this is all settled, legally, financially, we want you to know that we don't expect you to move away. If you want to stay in your home, we can work something out. Elaine looked at him in disbelief. After what I did, the neighborhood would never accept that. The neighborhood doesn't decide who lives there, Sarah said firmly. We do. All of us together. 3 days later, a community meeting was called at the Pinecrest Estates clubhouse. Nearly every household was represented, an unprecedented turnout. Harold Gibbons, as HOA president, tried to maintain order as neighbors argued about Elaine, about property values, about the future of their community. Michael stood up to address the crowd. I know many of you expected us to push for the maximum penalty, to sue for every penny. And believe me, there were days I wanted exactly that. He paused, looking around the room. But Sarah and I have come to realize something. This neighborhood, our home, is more than just houses and rules. It's people. And people mess up. People hurt. People need second chances. A murmur spread through the room. Michael continued, Elaine Winters did something terrible to our family. But before that, she taught many of your children. She volunteered at the community garden. She was a founding member of this neighborhood. She also reported my family for cooking Indian food. Mr. Patel called out angrily. Yes, she did, Michael acknowledged. And that was wrong. Prejudiced. Hurtful. She'll need to make amends for that too, if she wants to remain part of this community. But I'm standing here asking all of you, are we the kind of neighborhood that defines people by their worst moment? Or are we something better than that? The meeting lasted hours. Emotions ran high. Old grievances surfaced. But by the end, a fragile consensus had formed around a neighborhood mediation committee and a set of principles for addressing conflicts before they escalated. As Michael and Sarah drove home, Sarah reached over and took his hand. "Do you think it will work? People can be pretty unforgiving." Michael squeezed her hand. "I don't know, but I'd rather try than live with that concrete block of hatred in our backyard for the next 20 years. In the rearview mirror, the sun was setting behind the clubhouse, casting long shadows across the neighborhood they had chosen broken and now were trying somehow to rebuild. 1 year later, the Donovan family gathered around their newly rebuilt pool for its second grand opening. The water sparkled in the late May sunshine, reflecting the blue sky above. Custom lighting illuminated the underwater steps, and the sound of the waterfall feature created a peaceful backdrop to the excited chatter of guests. "This one's even better than the original," Michael's father commented, sipping a cold drink from the poolside bar they'd added to the new design. "Worth the wait, I'd say." Michael nodded, watching his children splash with their friends in the shallow end. The past year had been a long journey of reconstruction, not just of the pool, but of the neighborhood's social fabric. The healing process had been neither quick nor easy. The Layton accepted the plea deal, pleading guilty to felony criminal mischief with a suspended 5-year sentence. The court had mandated twice-weekly therapy sessions, community service, and full financial restitution. The sale of her car and some investments had covered about half the cost of rebuilding the pool. The remainder would come from monthly payments that would stretch over the next decade. Despite Michael and Sarah's offer, Elaine had ultimately decided to sell her house. "Too many memories," she could explain during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. "Both of Roger and of what I did. I need a fresh start." She had moved into a smaller home 15 minutes away, close enough to continue her therapy and community service, but far enough to escape the daily reminder of her lowest moment. Her daughter Amy had stayed in town for 3 months, helping with the transition and reconnecting with a mother who had been lost in grief for so long. The neighborhood mediation committee, born from that contentious community meeting, had proven surprisingly effective. Minor disputes that once might have festered now had a formal process for resolution. When the Andersons' oak tree dropped branches onto the Rodriguez family's roof during a storm, both families appeared before the committee instead of immediately calling lawyers. When teenagers from outside the neighborhood vandalized mailboxes, residents coordinated their security camera footage to help police identify the culprits instead of pointing fingers at one another. "You're deep in thought," Sarah said, appearing at Michael's side with a tray of appetizers for the guests. "Everything okay?" He smiled, pulling her close with one arm. "Just reflecting. Would you believe me if I said there were moments I'm almost grateful for what happened?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, grateful that a mentally unstable neighbor destroyed our $85,000 investment and turned our lives upside down for months. "Not for that part," Michael clarified, "but for what came after. Look around." Sarah surveyed their backyard, now filled with neighbors from across Pinecrest Estates. The Pat Hills were teaching the Johnsons' teenage daughter how to rap a sari for an upcoming Cultural Appreciation Day at school. Harold Gibbons, who had initially resisted many of the mediation committee's proposals, was now one of its most vocal supporters, currently engaged in animated conversation with the Garcias about a community garden expansion. "We've lived here almost 3 years, but this is the first time I feel like we're truly part of a community," Michael continued. "Not just people who happen to live in adjacent houses." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I still have moments when I'm angry about what happened. I don't think that ever goes away completely. Of course not. What she did was inexcusable. But," Sarah added, "I'm proud of how we handled it. How we all handled it, eventually." A commotion at the gate drew their attention. Emma, their 9-year-old daughter, was running toward them with excitement. "Mom, Dad, Miss Winters is here. Can she come in?" Michael and Sarah exchanged a glance of surprise. They had invited Elaine to the pool opening, part of their ongoing commitment to reconciliation, but hadn't expected her to actually appear. "Of course," Sarah said after a moment's hesitation. "Show her in, honey." Elaine entered the backyard tentatively, carrying a covered dish. She looked healthier than she had in court, her clothes neat and her posture more confident, though still lacking the rigid perfectionism of her Karen days. The conversations around the pool quieted momentarily as neighbors noticed her arrival, then resumed with slightly muted tones. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Elaine said, approaching Michael and Sarah, "but my therapist thought it might be an important step." She held out the dish. "I brought my mother's banana pudding. It used to be popular at neighborhood functions before." Michael accepted the dish with a genuine smile. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot." "I still can't believe you invited me," Elaine said quietly. "After everything." Sarah gestured toward the tables set up near the pool house. "There's plenty of food and drinks over there." Stay as long as you're comfortable. As Elaine moved toward the refreshment table, receiving cautious but not hostile greetings from former neighbors, Sarah turned to Michael. That can't have been easy for her. No, he agreed. But it wasn't easy for any of us. Later, as the party continued into early evening and lights came on around the pool, casting a warm glow across the water, Michael found himself standing next to Elaine at the edge of the gathering. It's beautiful, she said, nodding toward the pool. The design is lovely. Thanks, Michael replied. We made some changes from the original. Better drainage, for one thing. He gave her a meaningful look. Elaine winced slightly, then nodded. I deserve that. Sorry, Michael said. Old habits. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the children play Marco Polo in the shallow end, their shrieks of laughter echoing across the yard. I never thanked you properly, Elaine finally said. Not just for the plea deal arrangement, but for... She gestured vaguely around her. All of this. The second chance, the opportunity to make amends. She paused. Most people wouldn't have done that. Michael considered her words. A year ago, I wouldn't have either. I wanted you to pay, financially, legally, in every way possible. He watched his son Jake execute a cannonball dive, sending water splashing over giggling friends. But watching that cement being jackhammered out day after day, I realized something. We were spending so much energy breaking things apart. I didn't want that to be what our family was about. Elaine nodded slowly. My therapist says that's what I was doing too, trying to break things apart because I felt broken. It sounds simplistic when I say it out loud. But it's true, Michael said. The opposite of destruction isn't just rebuilding. It's creating something new. The case of State v. Elaine Winters was officially closed 3 months later when the judge ruled that she had fulfilled all the initial conditions of her probation. The felony would remain on her record, but the suspended sentence would be reduced to 3 years rather than 5 if she continued her therapy and community service. Local news outlets, which had initially dubbed the incident the Concrete Karen case, ran follow-up stories about neighborhood mediation and conflict resolution. The Pinecrest Estates model was being adopted by communities across the county, with Harold Gibbons giving presentations to other homeowners associations about their success. When the Donovan family gathered for Thanksgiving that November, they had an unexpected addition to their traditional gratitude ritual. Their next-door neighbor, a young couple with a newborn who had purchased Elaine's former house, joined them for dessert. We heard so many stories about this neighborhood before we moved in. Jennifer Hayes admitted as she cradled her infant son. About the famous pool incident, people warned us not to buy the Karen house. Her husband nodded agreement, but then we kept hearing about how the community came together afterward. That's why we chose Pinecrest, not despite what happened, but because of how everyone responded. Michael caught Sarah's eye across the table, sharing a private smile. They had weathered a storm that could have destroyed their dream home, their sense of security, and their faith in community. Instead, they had emerged with something stronger, not by burying the conflict in concrete, but by breaking it open, confronting the damage, and deliberately building something new from the rubble. Outside, the pool lay covered for the winter, waiting for spring. But around the Thanksgiving table, in the warmth of newfound friendship and hard-won wisdom, Michael raised his glass. To neighbors, he said simply, the ones we choose and the ones who choose us. To neighbors, everyone echoed, including Elaine, who had been invited for coffee and had decided to stay. And to new beginnings.